Hi there. I'm Paul Vidich, and I'm the second son. And thank you for organizing this. And Charlie, thank you for your incredible the work you've done to sort of organize both Arthur's life and Virginia's life. I don't think I would have the same relationship with them now without your sort of, organized approach to bringing their lives to the present. So thank you very much. And if any of you haven't seen the website and are interested in some of the personal things that he's put together, it's really quite moving. Although I have to correct you on one thing.
Sure, go ahead.
They didn't meet when he went from Lejeune to New York City. They had actually
Paris
met.
Island, Paris Island.
They'd actually met at the University of Wisconsin, and they met again. So that's one of the benefits of being a relative. I can correct the record. I also feel I'm going to talk a little bit about Hans Gerth and my father's relationship, but I'd also like to say I'm in sort of an interesting and sometimes sort of reflective position because I sit on the board of the New School now. And I joined about 2 years after my father died. And as many of you know, he had long-standing gripes and feuds with the administration of the New School. So I find myself sitting on the board, often dealing with issues at the administrative level, wondering which side he would take on the issue at hand. And I feel his ghost in the room, and I also see his, his work sort of in reflective ways in the current sociology department. And Will Milberg, who's the current dean, is a wonderful guy. And every time we see each other, we talk about the tennis games that they would have in Southampton. So it's for me, there is a continuing relationship to my father's legacy through this thing, the New School. Having said that, I want to talk a little bit about Hans Gerth, and I won't be long, but and as all of you know, and I sort of somewhat discovered again by reading his autobiography, Hans Gerth played an outsized role in Arthur Vidich's personal and intellectual life. Arthur met Hans Gerth, and he always referred to him as Gerth, or Hans Gerth, but never as Hans. In 1940, when Arthur was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, and Gerth was newly arrived in Madison with his young German wife, having escaped the war. Arthur was drawn to Gerth's class, and he began auditing a seminar that he gave on social psychology, public opinion, and mass communication, themes that Arthur would pick up in his own career and make his own. And Gerth was the first professor that left a lasting impression on Arthur. In his autobiography, which Arthur wrote when he was 80, he said, "I can still remember Gerth's lecture in detail." And he goes on to describe one evening in his lecture on mass communications in which Gerth had brought in the New York Times, which had printed a joint ecumenical statement released by the World Council of Churches, then holding meetings in Stockholm. And Gerth proceeded to show why each word in the statement was the result of compromises that each faith was required to make in order to arrive at a joint statement. And Arthur, recalling this at the age of 82, called it Gerthian linguistic tour de force. And he saw in this erudite, gentlemanly German a passionate thinker about the world. And that impressed him because he had never really seen that in his life at that point. Gerth introduced Arthur to the ideas of European thinkers and then applied those analyses himself to American institutions. And it was in this way that the origin of Arthur's perspective on his own work, The Small Town of Massasoit, where he turned an anthropological lens on Springdale, New York. Arthur was open about the fact that Gerth's historical knowledge and depth of erudition overwhelmed him and provoked him, and showed him the type of intellectual that he would want to become. When Authur and Virginia, my mother, left Madison in 1948, they made a point of saying farewell to Gerth and his German wife, Hedwig. Author was traveling to Harvard's PhD program. Author and Gerth had become close personally during those 3 or 4 years. Arthur had once brought Goethe to his Madison apartment to meet his own father, Joseph Vidich, who was a coal miner and a saloon keeper with little formal education. And I think my father was always wanted affirmation from his own father and never really quite received it. And his own father was not, his English was not great. So I think there was definitely a tension there. So to present Goethe to his own father was an interesting event. And then Goethe went on to interview Joseph about his life as a young man in Kropa. And he treated Joseph with this great respect that impressed Authur. And Authur admitted that after that, leaving Goethe for Harvard was like leaving a surrogate parent. Goethe asked Authur to extend his greetings to Talcott Parsons at Harvard. Goethe and Parsons were both Weberians. Authur opened the conversation by saying to Parsons, "I studied with Goethe at Wisconsin. He asked me to send his regards." And Parsons said tartly, "Goethe should learn how to write English." And in this indirect way, Goethe introduced Authur to the petty rivalries of academia, which became a topic of great interest in his career. Authur learned also about the New School from Goethe while he lived in Madison, and he was taken by it. He thought of the New School as this exotic place with a unique faculty, a provocative approach to ideas, and a compelling history. Authur taught there later for a quarter of a century, and it sort of was a defining moment in his career. But in joining the New School, Authur also came to live in the West Village, and he loved the West Village, and it too was a defining part of his life. He'd grown up in an urban, ethnic neighborhood in West Allis, and he found the South Village on Bedford Street a slightly more urbane version of his own childhood experience. When I came to New York, as Charlie did, and I think we all did, while he was commuting back and forth from stores, I remember how he seemed to walk the streets of the village, going to the cafes, talking about beat culture, and he absorbed it and felt very much at home there. They lived on Bedford Street from 1970 to 78, although in retrospect it feels a lot longer. And then he moved with Mary to Fort Greene, which was then a marginal neighborhood, but no longer. But his heart really remained in the West Village. The townhouse on Bedford Street was a guest room, had a guest room for European visitors. The ground floor study was where he and Joe spent hours editing manuscripts they had written together. And he loved the things that he could do in the neighborhood. He bought cheese from Murray's on Cornelia Street. You all were probably guests of that cheese. He would buy fresh bread from the baker on Bleecker Street. He'd have wine from the liquor store on Conmarn Street. And he had his own favorite restaurants near the New School. And he was a member of the Harvard Club on 45th Street. And that's where he and I, for about 10 years, would have lunch twice a year. He enjoyed the setting, although he disparaged the food, as we all would if you would go there. But it was at 40 Bedford Street that I first met Hans Goethe for the first and only time. Art and Mary were living in Belgrade for several months, and Goethe was staying in the townhouse. I had keys to the house, and I let myself in and was surprised to find this gray-haired man sitting at my father's desk in the second floor study. We startled each other and quickly figured out who each of us was and that there was no need to call the police. We sat in the study for several hours. He graciously asked me about my studies, taking an interest in an 18-year-old, and gradually he began to talk about himself, his life in America, and his regrets. Personal things that you don't share with people you know, but can openly describe to strangers. And I was a stranger. I remember the story of his wife, Hedwig, a proud German woman who left Germany, ripped away from her family, who never adapted well to the Midwest. She was lonely. He described how he found her in her bedroom, having cut her wrists and bled to death. This had happened years before, but he still carried the weight of her death. And I was moved by his reflections on their life together and her choice. I saw the power of Goethe's storytelling, the power of his insights and his vulnerability. And I understood how this man could cast a spell over a young man eager for knowledge, as he had done with Authur when they first met. Thank you.